Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I've driven cross-country more times than I can count, but there's one stretch of highway in Montana that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. This happened 3 years ago when I was driving my old 2003 Honda Civic from Seattle to Chicago. I decided to take the back roads to avoid the interstate traffic, which turned out to be the worst decision I've ever made. It was around 1:30 in the morning when I first heard the grinding noise. I was on Highway 200, somewhere between nowhere and the middle of nowhere, when my engine started making this awful metal-on-metal sound. The temperature gauge was climbing, and I knew I was in trouble. By the time I pulled over at mile marker 47, steam was already pouring from under the hood. The silence hit me first. You know that kind of quiet that makes your ears ring? That's exactly what surrounded me. No traffic, no wind, just the tick, tick, tick of my cooling engine and the sound of my own breathing. I was 40 miles from Glendive, Montana, which might as well have been on Mars. My phone showed no bars, naturally. I remembered seeing an emergency call box about a quarter-mile back, so I grabbed my flashlight and started walking. The gravel crunched under my sneakers, and every few seconds I'd turn around to make sure my car was still visible. The darkness out there isn't like city darkness. It's complete, like being inside a cave. The call box worked, thank God. I dialed AAA and explained my situation to a dispatcher named Patricia. She sounded tired but professional. "We'll have someone out there in 2 to 3 hours," she said. "It's pretty remote, so it'll take some time to get a truck to you." 3 hours. I walked back to my car and settled in to wait, keeping the doors locked and the interior light off to save the battery. The engine was still ticking as it cooled down, creating this irregular rhythm that started to get on my nerves. I tried to sleep, but every little sound made me jump. Around 2:45 a.m., I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. A pickup truck was approaching slowly, way slower than you'd normally drive on a highway. As it passed me, I caught a glimpse of the driver, an older guy wearing a baseball cap. He didn't stop, but he definitely slowed down to look at me. Something about the way he stared made my skin crawl. 15 minutes later, the same truck came back from the other direction. This time he slowed down even more, almost to a crawl. I pretended to be asleep, but I could feel him watching me through my car windows. After what felt like forever, he drove off again. The third time he came by, around 3:30 a.m., I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the gravel outside my car. I kept my eyes shut tight, barely breathing as someone walked a complete circle around my Honda. The steps stopped right at my driver's side door for what felt like an eternity. When I finally opened my eyes, the pickup truck was gone. And so were the footsteps. But my hands were shaking so bad I could barely dial my phone when I got a single bar of signal. I called AAA again. This time, a different dispatcher answered, a guy named Marcus who sounded confused when I gave him my information. "I don't see any record of a service call to that location," he said. "Are you sure you called us?" My heart sank. "I called 3 hours ago. The dispatcher's name was Patricia." "Hold on." I could hear typing in the background. "We don't have anyone named Patricia working tonight, sir. But I can get someone out to you. ETA is about 2 hours, so around 5 a.m. 2 more hours. I hung up and tried to convince myself that dispatch systems glitch all the time. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Very wrong. Around 4 a.m., someone knocked on my trunk. 2 sharp knocks, like they were testing to see if I was awake. I was too terrified to turn around and look. I just sat there, gripping my steering wheel, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. The knocking didn't come again, but I found fresh cigarette butts scattered around my car the next morning. Cigarette butts that definitely weren't there when I first broke down. The strangest thing was my radio. It kept changing stations by itself, cycling through static and fragments of late-night talk shows. I'd turn it off, and it would turn itself back on. I'd change it to a specific station, and 5 minutes later it would be on something completely different. As dawn started to break around 6 a.m., I called AAA for the third time. A woman named Janet answered, and when I explained my situation, she said something that chilled me to the bone. "Sir, we don't show any service calls for that area all night. Are you sure you're a AAA member?" Either I was losing my mind or something was very, very wrong. I was tired, scared, and starting to panic when I noticed a farmhouse about half a mile away across a field. I could see smoke coming from the chimney, which meant people were awake. I decided to walk over and ask to use their phone. I grabbed my wallet and started across the field, my sneakers getting soaked in the morning dew. I was about halfway there when I heard an engine behind me. The same pickup truck was back, driving slowly along the shoulder where my car was parked. The truck pulled up next to the fence line and stopped. The driver rolled down his window and smiled at me. It was the same older guy I'd seen earlier, but now I could see him clearly. He had weathered skin, gray stubble, and eyes that seemed too bright for the early morning light. "Having car trouble?" he called out, like he didn't already know the answer. There was something off about his smile, something that made me want to run. The way he said it, the way he was looking at me. It was like he'd been expecting this conversation. "Yeah, but I've got a tow truck coming soon," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded slowly, still smiling, that wrong smile. "Yeah, I know. I've been watching you wait." The casual way he said it hit me like a punch to the gut. He'd been watching me all night while I sat there terrified and alone. This man had been out there in the darkness, watching. He drove off without another word, leaving me standing in that field with my heart pounding. I ran the rest of the way to the farmhouse, but nobody answered when I knocked. The smoke I'd seen was coming from a burn barrel in the yard, not the chimney. When I got back to my car 20 minutes later, a real tow truck was finally pulling up. The driver, a middle-aged guy named Carl, was apologetic about the delay. As he hooked up my Honda, he mentioned something that still haunts me. "Weird thing," Carl said, adjusting his chains. "I saw that same pickup truck parked up the road when I was driving out here. Guy in a baseball cap just sitting there like he was camping out or something. Did you see where he went?" I asked. Carl shook his head. "Nope. But I'll tell you what. Local police have been getting reports about someone out here impersonating tow truck services, approaching stranded drivers, offering help then." He shrugged. "Well, let's just say those drivers don't make it to their destinations. I never found out who the man in the pickup truck was or why he spent hours watching me wait on that empty highway." Carl towed me to Glendive, where I had my transmission repaired and spent an extra night in a motel, too shaken to drive. These days, I stick to the main highways, even if it adds hours to my trips. And when I see someone broken down on a lonely road at night, I always call it into the local police. Because sometimes the people who stop to help aren't really there to help at all. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. 2 months after the Montana incident, I thought I'd learned my lesson about back roads and breakdowns. I was wrong. This time I was driving from Phoenix to Denver, taking Interstate 40 through Arizona. It was supposed to be a straightforward drive, nothing like the remote highways I'd sworn off after Montana. Everything was going fine until I hit the desert stretch between Flagstaff and Albuquerque. My temperature gauge started climbing around 2 p.m., and by 2:30, steam was pouring from under the hood. The radiator had given up completely. I pulled over at mile marker 47, right in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but desert scrub and heat waves in every direction. The temperature outside had to be pushing 110 degrees. I called for a tow, but the earliest anyone could reach me was the next morning. The dispatcher, a woman named Rachel, suggested I find somewhere to stay nearby and gave me the number for a local mechanic who could meet me in the morning. The only structure visible from where I stood was an old motel about a quarter-mile off the highway. It looked abandoned from a distance. Faded paint, missing letters on the sign, weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot. But as the sun started to set and the temperature began to drop, I didn't have much choice. I grabbed my overnight bag and started walking. The motel was called the Desert Rose Inn, according to the broken sign out front. Most of the letters were either missing or hanging at odd angles, but I could make out enough to read it. The parking lot had 2 cars in it, both covered in a thick layer of dust, like they'd been sitting there for months. As I approached the front office, the neon vacancy sign suddenly flickered on, buzzing and casting everything in sick pink light. An elderly man appeared behind the counter like he'd been waiting for me. "Car trouble?" he asked, not looking up from whatever paperwork he was shuffling. "Happens all the time out here." "Radiator?" "Yeah, how did you know?" He finally looked at me, and his eyes were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost white. "Only reason people stop here anymore. That'll be $40 for the night, cash only." The room was number 12 at the far end of the building. The key was an actual metal key attached to a plastic diamond that said Desert Rose in faded gold letters. The carpet in the room was stained in patterns I didn't want to think about, and the air conditioning unit under the window wheezed like it was dying. The whole place smelled musty, like it had been closed up for years. I called Jake, the mechanic Rachel had recommended. He sounded friendly enough and promised to meet me at 8 a.m. to take a look at the radiator. "Should be a simple fix," he said. "Those old Hondas are pretty reliable." After hanging up, I tried to settle in for the night. The TV only picked up one local channel showing old Western movies, and the phone in the room didn't have a dial tone. I was exhausted from the heat and stress of the breakdown, so I decided to get some sleep early. That's when I started noticing things. Around 10 p.m., I heard voices coming from the room next door. Room 14. It sounded like a man and woman arguing, their voices muffled but clearly agitated. I hadn't seen anyone else check in, and when I looked out my window, the parking lot still only had those same 2 dusty cars. An hour later, I needed ice for the warm soda I'd bought from a vending machine. The ice machine was down the hall, humming and rattling like it was on its last legs. But as I filled my bucket, I could swear I heard something else, a soft crying sound coming from inside the machine itself. I hurried back to my room, but the crying followed me. It seemed to be coming from the walls, a sound so faint I couldn't be sure I wasn't imagining it. Around midnight, the knocking started. It was soft at first, just a gentle tap, tap, tap on my door. I figured it might be the desk clerk or maybe another guest, so I got up to check the peephole. The hallway was empty, lit by a single flickering fluorescent light that made everything look sickly green. The knocking came again, a little louder this time. I called out, "Hello? Who is it?" but got no response. Just silence, then more knocking. Rhythmic, patient, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world. This went on for hours. Every time I started to drift off, the knocking would resume. Sometimes from my door, sometimes from the walls, sometimes from the ceiling above my bed. I was too scared to open the door and too wired to sleep. At 3 a.m., I got up to use the bathroom and noticed something that made my skin crawl. There was a gap under my door, maybe an inch high, and I could see shadows moving back and forth in the hallway. Someone was pacing outside my room, their feet visible as dark shapes passing by the sliver of light. I waited until 5 a.m. for the shadows to disappear, then ventured out to the front desk to ask for a bottle of water. The office was empty, but the door was unlocked. Behind the counter, I found the guest register lying open. My name was there in the clerk's handwriting, but instead of room 12, it showed room 14. The same room I'd been hearing the arguing voices from all night. My hands were shaking as I flipped back through the pages. The last entry before mine was dated 3 months ago. According to the register, I was the only guest who'd checked in since May. I had to see room 14 for myself. I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the early morning silence. The door to room 14 was identical to mine, but when I tried the handle, it was unlocked. The lock mechanism looked broken, like it had been forced. Inside, the room was a mirror image of mine. Same layout, same furniture, same stained carpet. But everything was wrong. The wallpaper was peeling and moldy, the furniture was rotting, and spider webs hung from every corner. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. On the bed was an overnight bag just like mine. Same brand, same color, same size. But when I got closer, I could see it was covered in dust and filled with clothes that looked like they'd been there for years. I ran back to my room, threw my stuff in my bag, and waited by the window for Jake the mechanic to arrive. At exactly 8 a.m., his pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. He was a nice guy, probably in his 50s, and he had my radiator fixed within an hour. As he handed me the bill, Jake glanced at the motel and frowned. "Where'd you stay last night?" "Here," I said, pointing to the Desert Rose Inn. "Room 12. Jake looked confused. "What motel?" I turned around, and my blood turned to ice. The building looked completely different in the daylight. The windows were boarded up, the neon sign was dark and broken, and weeds grew through every crack in the foundation. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. "Ain't nothing but desert for 20 miles, Jake said, still looking puzzled. "You feeling all right?" I drove away without looking back, but I kept the receipt from the Desert Rose Inn in my wallet. It's dated and shows I paid $40 cash for room 12. Sometimes I take it out and stare at it, proof that what happened to me was real, even if nobody else believes it. I did some research later and found out that the Desert Rose Inn had burned down in 1987. 23 people died in the fire, including the elderly owner who'd been running the place since the 1960s. According to the news reports, most of the victims were found in their rooms like they'd never tried to escape. The really disturbing part: every victim was found in room 14. After 2 breakdowns that led me to places that shouldn't exist, you'd think I would have learned to stick to major highways and well-traveled routes. But 6 months later, I found myself driving through the Cascade Mountains in Oregon when my transmission finally gave up completely. I was about an hour outside of Bend when the grinding noise started, followed by the smell of burning fluid. By the time I pulled over, my car wouldn't go into any gear. I was stuck on a winding Forest Service road with no cell service and darkness falling fast through the towering pine trees. My GPS showed a campground called Pine Ridge about 2 miles ahead. It wasn't much, but it would give me somewhere to spend the night before calling for a tow in the morning. The road got narrower and more overgrown as I followed the GPS directions, branches scraping against my windows and gravel crunching under my tires. When I finally reached Pine Ridge Campground, I was surprised by how well maintained it looked. The entrance had a nice wooden sign and a small ranger station, though nobody was there. Inside the campground, there were about a dozen sites, each with a picnic table, fire ring, and bare box. Everything was clean and organized, but completely empty. What struck me as odd was that despite being so remote, I suddenly had full cell service. 5 bars, stronger than I get in most cities. I called a towing company in Bend, and the dispatcher said they could have someone out by 6 a.m. if I could give them good directions. I set up my tent at Site 7, which had a nice view of the surrounding forest. As darkness fell, I built a fire and heated up a can of soup for dinner. The campground was peaceful, just the sound of wind in the pines and the occasional crackle from my fire. That's when I started noticing the details that didn't add up. All the picnic tables faced the same direction, toward the tree line on the eastern edge of the campground. Not toward the fire rings or the road, but toward the dark forest where the trees grew thick and close together. I'd been camping for years, and I'd never seen anything like it. Around 10 p.m., I walked around the campground to stretch my legs before bed. Several of the other campsites had fresh tire tracks in the dirt, like vehicles had been there recently. But there were no campers, no tents, no signs of anyone having stayed there. Just empty sites with tire tracks and picnic tables facing the woods. I was getting ready to turn in when I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Children laughing, coming from deep in the forest. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of kids playing, maybe 3 or 4 of them, giggling and calling out to each other. The laughter echoed strangely through the trees, bouncing back from different directions like it was coming from everywhere at once. I called out, "Hello? Is someone out there?" But the laughter stopped immediately. My fire kept dying, which was strange, because I was using dry pine wood that should have burned easily. Every 20 minutes or so, the flames would dwindle to nothing, and I'd have to rebuild it. It was like something was drawing the heat away. Around 11 p.m., I swept my flashlight beam across the tree line and caught something that made my heart skip. Tall, dark shapes standing between the trees, perfectly still. At first, I thought they were just tree trunks, but then one of them moved, a subtle shift to the left, disappearing behind another tree. I kept my light trained on the forest, and slowly I began to make out more shapes. They were arranged in a rough circle around the campground, standing just inside the tree line where the shadows were deepest. Whenever I focused my beam on one spot, whatever was there would glide silently to another position. The children's laughter started again around midnight, closer this time. I could hear them moving through the underbrush, but I never saw them. The laughter had a quality to it that was all wrong, too bright, too joyful for the middle of the night in a dark forest. I retreated to my tent and zipped it completely shut, but that didn't help much. Around 1 a.m. I heard footsteps circling my tent, light steps like bare feet on pine needles. They moved slowly, deliberately, making a complete circuit around me before stopping. Then came the whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but the voices sounded young. Children whispering to each other just outside my tent, their voices mixing with suppressed giggles. It sounded like they were playing some kind of game, and I was part of it whether I wanted to be or not. Around 2 a.m., something brushed against the side of my tent, a gentle touch that moved slowly along the fabric from bottom to top. Then it moved to another spot and did the same thing, like small hands exploring the surface, trying to figure out what was inside. The most terrifying moment came when my tent zipper started moving. Very slowly, one tooth at a time, someone was trying to open my tent from the outside. I grabbed the zipper pull from the inside and held it tight, feeling gentle but persistent tugging from the other side. The children's laughter was right outside now, so close I could feel their breath through the thin tent fabric. They sounded delighted, like this was the best game they'd played in years. "Come play with us," one of them whispered, so softly I almost thought I'd imagined it. "We've been waiting so long." I held that zipper closed until my hand cramped, listening to them whisper and giggle just inches away from my face. Sometime around 4 a.m., exhaustion finally took over and I fell into a fitful sleep. I woke to the sound of a truck horn at exactly 6 a.m. Jake from Mountain View Towing was right on time, his flatbed truck rumbling into the campground like salvation itself. "Morning," Jake called out as I crawled out of my tent. "How'd you find this old place?" "My GPS showed it," I said, still groggy and disoriented. "Why do you ask?" Jake scratched his head and looked around the campground. "Well, this place has been closed for about 15 years now, ever since those kids went missing. My blood ran cold. What kids? 3 or 4 of them, I think. Family was camping here back in maybe 2008 or 2009. Kids wandered off into the woods one evening and never came back. Search and rescue spent weeks looking for them. Jake shook his head. Never found so much as a footprint. Forest Service shut the place down after that. As Jake loaded my car onto his flatbed, I checked my GPS navigation history. There was no record of Pine Ridge Campground in my recent destinations. According to my phone, I'd driven straight to my current location without stopping anywhere. On the drive back to Bend, Jake mentioned that the Forest Service had no record of a campground at those coordinates. The area had been designated wilderness since the 1970s. No camping, no facilities, no development of any kind. I never found out what happened to my tent and camping gear. When we got back to town, I was so rattled that I forgot all about it. By the time I remembered, Jake's truck was gone, and when I called him, he said there hadn't been any camping equipment on his flatbed. Sometimes I wonder if I actually made it out of that campground, or if I'm still there in my tent, listening to children who will never grow up, playing games that never end. The laughter echoes in my dreams, and every now and then I wake up with pine needles in my hair. Thanks for listening. If you made it through the darkness of these stories, you're braver than most. Some roads are meant to be traveled alone, and some places exist only when you need them most, or when they need you. But next time your car breaks down in the middle of nowhere, remember what I learned. Sometimes the help you find isn't really help at all. Sometimes it's just the beginning of something much worse.